Can I ask everyone to take their seats, please, and we'll try to begin this next panel.
Thank you.
Okay, let's begin. Thanks everyone for being here today. We're so excited to be able to have presented these new resources to you, and I'm very excited about this next panel. My name is Laura Patching. I'm the Deputy Chief of the Office of Citizenship, and this will be the first of our two panel discussions this morning. This was entitled Becoming American, New Research and Analysis of Citizenship and Integration. This will put into context the new federal resources that we introduced today, and we'll talk about how immigrants become motivated to apply for citizenship, why indeed this matters to us as a nation, and how our perceptions and priorities as a nation may have changed over time. I'm pleased to be joined by several distinguished panelists, and I'll introduce them only briefly. You have their full bios in your materials. First, we have Tiffany Lightbourne, who is the Chief of the Research and Evaluation Division of USCIS's Office of Policy and Strategy. She manages our research agenda and has significant experience both from her academic career as a professor and through her work with the DHS Science and Technology Directorate, which is the department's main division to support academic research on a broad range of homeland security topics. It's my pleasure also to welcome Katie Benton-Cohen, an associate professor at Georgetown University, and through this past spring, a Woodrow Wilson Center Fellow. Her presentation today will draw from historical research on the Dillington Commission of Immigration that took place from 1907 to 1911. Finally, we'll hear from Doris Meissner, who really needs no introduction, but I will briefly anyway. Doris is a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, where she directs their work on U.S. immigration policy. She previously served in the Clinton administration as the Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the legacy agency that became, in part, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service during the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. After our panelists conclude their remarks, I'll open it up to questions, and I hope this will produce some engaging and robust discussion. With that, I'll turn it to Tiffany, please.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm quite happy to see that people stayed after the break for the data part of the agenda. My name is Tiffany Lightbourne, as has been said, and I work in the Office of Policy and Strategy. My group, the Research and Evaluation Unit, all of which is in the back row, a small but nimble team, works on a wide range of topics for CIS, but with the goal of providing senior-level decision makers with actionable information, empirical data with which to make their decisions. And we were excited to work with the Office of Citizenship on a survey of recently naturalized citizens so that we could learn more about our customer base in this particular area. Let's see if there we go. Back in 2008, we had what was a record number of people who applied for citizenship. And this followed several years of slightly above average naturalizations. But as an agency, we were a little caught off guard by how many people applied for citizenship during that time period. And so little was understood about what caused that naturalization surge. And so we decided to do a study about the group of people who decided to apply for citizenship and what impacted not only their decision to become a U.S. citizen, but that particular timing of their decision. And then we wanted to look at the questions that are near and dear to the Office of Citizenship's heart, which is how are these people faring once they become U.S. citizens as well. So once on the path to citizenship, what are the outcomes for people once they become American? USCIS is a mission-based organization, and we justify everything we do, and even though it may sound like we have an extremely large budget, we use it to cover a variety of topic areas. And we wanted to make sure that this study in particular could help us in three ways. We wanted to better understand our customer base and have some demographic and social information that would allow us to better target our services. We're a customer-centric organization, and the more we know about our customers, the better we can target those services to them. We also wanted to look at levels of immigrant integration, which would help us create effective outreach. It's one of our key challenges as an organization. We have a very diverse community of people that come through our doors for benefits, and we want to make sure that we are targeting our outreach in ways that help them on the path to integration. And in terms of our workload, we always want to be not caught off guard by surges in applications. And so we want to be able to have data not only on why people might naturalize, but potentially looking toward the future and being able to forecast who else our recently naturalized citizens might petition for in terms of family members to become citizens or to become over to the United States in the future. So giving us a sense of what our future workloads and streams might be was another purpose of doing this particular study. And now for the part that I have to do, but don't fall asleep, tell you a little bit about the methodology. We began this study. We collected the data in October of 2009 to February of 2010, and we had a nationally representative sample of about 4,313 newly naturalized citizens. We contacted all 10,000 folks who met our sampling strata, and we were able to contact about 7,700 of them successfully, which when you think about an era where a lot of people are using cell phones, are extremely mobile population, and the government is calling to ask you about your experiences using its services, was quite robust in terms of a response rate. We created our survey instrument from scratch by adapting questions from previous research on immigrants, as well as constructing new questions that would answer our agency-specific questions. And we had the questionnaire design reviewed by an expert panel that included immigration researchers, policy experts, and survey methodologists. We then also did key informant interviews with practitioners to make sure that people who work in immigrant communities and provide immigrant services thought that the questions would resonate with their populations. And we also did cognitive interviews on the survey instrument and several rounds of pre-tests before finalizing the questionnaire. So we were able to think about how we were going to devise our sampling in two stages. We had a two-stage disproportionate stratified sample. In stage one, we had 100 primary sampling units comprised of U.S. counties or groups based on them having a minimum threshold of naturalized citizens from the fiscal year. And then we drew a random sample within each of those PSUs to ensure representation from the 12 most populous countries of origin that utilize our services. The survey was administered over the telephone using computer-assisted telephone interviewing with an accompanying abridged mail survey sent to reluctant non-responders. And because we're persistent, we even engaged in tracking and in-person recruitment for people who were the hardest to reach. And that actually was quite useful because it ended up making our sample more inclusive. And in particular, in some communities where both the mail and the phone surveys didn't work, that in-person recruitment allowed us to get particularly South Asian immigrants more represented in the sample. The survey was conducted in English and in 7 languages: Spanish, Hindi, Gujarati, Tagalog, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Vietnamese. And third-party interviewers were utilized for all other languages. And when I say all other languages, we had nearly all other languages. So it was quite an effort to conduct this kind of a survey. We know that immigrants from all over the world become U.S. citizens, and the largest groups are often from countries that border the United States. So it's no surprise that particularly Mexico made up a large part of our sample. And we had a group that we called other North American countries that included countries we classically think of North America, like Canada, but also some others that we would, in the research world, not typically think of as North American. So we also had some Caribbean and Central American countries in that other North American category. But by having that group, other Asian countries, Europe, South America, India, Philippines, Africa, China, Vietnam, and the Dominican Republic, we covered the groups that we largely serve as well as some regions of interest. In terms of our initial findings, this is really just a sneak peek. What we'll hope to have by the end of the year is a more thorough report that we can share with the public, and that will look into all of the questions that we asked on the survey. So even today, I'm not going to get into a number of topics that we looked at, like plans to petition family members, some of the household characteristics, perceptions and experiences with discrimination in the United States, identity issues, those kinds of things that we researchers are really interested in. I'm going to focus on some of the more mission-centered questions and give you a sense of how the data is progressing. We found that new citizens came to the country primarily during the 1990s. Excuse me. In a majority of our sample, 65%, lived in the United States at least 10 years before naturalizing. It's a question we often get about how long do people stay in the country before they become a citizen. And we found that 41% came to the U.S. to stay in the 1990s. In terms of how they're doing and thinking about employment issues, 74% of our respondents were either working full-time, part-time, or were self-employed. 10% worked more than one job. 8% were temporarily laid off or jobless and looking for work. And then 18%, we'll call them the lucky 18%, were not in the labor force at all. They may be retired homemakers, or actually they also could be part of the disabled population who were not looking for work. The survey had a number of different occupations that we saw people occupying, but they were not necessarily equally spread out by subgroup. And so one of the interesting analyses will be to look at some more which countries of origins held which types of occupations. But we saw that 29% of our sample were professional workers, 19% service workers, and 11% skilled tradespersons. In terms of education, 18% of our respondents are currently attending school. 48% of those are in college, and 18% are in an ESL course. 52% of our respondents completed at least some college. So not shown here may be the number of years of schooling they completed in the United States versus abroad, but that may also have some interesting implications in terms of integration indicators. In terms of English knowledge, we found that our sample had people with varying comfort levels in terms of speaking and understanding English. We saw that 50% of non-native English speakers understood spoken English very well, and 37% said that they speak it very well. And 12% of our respondents took English classes to prepare for the naturalization test. But we do see some subgroup differences that would probably be expected. More than 75% of Indians and Filipinos understand spoken English very well, but less than 20% of Vietnamese, Mexicans, and Chinese said that they speak English very well. In terms of internet use, we saw that 61% of our respondents reported that they had access to the internet during the naturalization process. So one of the reasons we're really happy about the Office of Citizenship expanding its e-presence is that we are able to reach communities in ways 24/7 around the clock. 85% of the sample that had internet access in their homes, and 76% of those used the internet to get naturalization information. In terms of preparing for the exam, as people mentioned, it's not just about English, but also about civics. 25% of the respondents had assistance in preparing for the history and government portion of the exam. Many of them got help from family members or friends, maybe using flashcards at home and asking them questions, etc. And 24% of them had taken formal classes, like ESL classes or citizenship classes, to help them prepare for that portion of the exam. And they rated the materials that CIS provided as quite helpful. In terms of applying for citizenship, even though we know that this application process is not just routine, it's not a paper stamp process, it's an actual process to become a U.S. citizen. 91% of the people who applied were approved on their first application. Of those whose application was rejected, the main reason appeared to be English language issues, followed by they didn't pass the test or interview, there was an error on their application, they weren't eligible, they didn't have the right paperwork, or they simply missed their appointment. In terms of reasons for migrating, most immigrants came to the U.S. to accompany or to join family members. We asked the question, about what was your primary reason for coming to the United States, and 35% came to join family. 18% came with a family member, and we also asked how many, for the entire sample, how many had any family members in the United States when they arrived, and 68% of the sample had a family member in the United States when they arrived. In terms of reasons for naturalizing, respondents indicated a variety of reasons as very important in their decision to naturalize. One of the factors particularly unique to the year that we did this particular data collection is that 70% of our sample naturalized because they wanted to be able to vote. 67% said to protect their civil and legal rights, and 55% said more affectively they wanted to feel or become more American. Of note, even though in anti-immigrant rhetoric you hear a lot about immigrants naturalizing to utilize state benefits, that particular reason for naturalization was indicated as very important, way less than these more political participation, political integration, or affective reasons for wanting to become a citizen. In terms of the timing of naturalization, we asked respondents what was the most important reason that you naturalized in 2007, 2008, and 42% of them said it was the ability to vote in the upcoming election. 19% said that they were doing so because of the application fee was about to increase and they wanted to beat the fee increase. Practical. I always like a deal. In terms of other reasons that we saw quite often, some said that they wanted to be able to travel internationally more easily. They felt that they were finally able to pass the English test. They wanted to sponsor relatives, or they wanted to keep the citizenship of their home country, and now this was a good time to apply. So we're seeing quite a bit of things affecting the timing. And in terms of changes since naturalization, we're seeing a number of things that have changed in the life of our population. 18% have moved, and which attributes to some of the mobility of this population. 16% have purchased property, which is kind of an important thing in the life course. 12% changed their name. We know that with immigrant populations, sometimes the Americanization of the last name is something that people go through, and naturalization is an opportunity for you to change your name. Actually, you're asked that as part of the interview, if that's something that you'd like to do. They also applied for jobs that had only been open to U.S. citizens, so they're getting access to other employment opportunities that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And they're joining clubs, voluntary organizations, and political organizations. And so we're seeing the markers of the start of a real integration. On the affective side, we asked people about what are some of the other changes they've felt since naturalization. 90% of our sample feel a greater attachment to the United States. We also see that 86% feel that they're a more equal member of U.S. society, that they're having more job opportunities, and that their quality of life has greatly improved. And so these are generally the changes we hope for when someone becomes a citizen. We also ask questions about their diaspora life, how they're participating in their home country versus the United States. And we find in every category, nearly every subgroup was more likely to participate in the life of the United States than in their home country. And so they're more likely to follow politics in the news, contact a government official, contribute to a PAC, vote in an election, serve on a jury, or participate in politics in any way in the United States than back home. There are a number of ways to look at sort of some of the identity questions about what it means to be an American. And we asked new citizens about their own identification as Americans. We asked our respondents whether they thought of themselves first as an American or first as a person from their country of origin. And we found that more than half of our new citizens, 57%, think of themselves as American first. 12% of themselves think of themselves as from their country of origin first. And 31% think of themselves as both equally. And not surprisingly, when it comes to length of stay in the United States, those who've been here the longest, 21 years or more, make up the largest percent of those folks who think of themselves as American first. We also asked a question about what being a U.S. citizen means, what makes someone fully American. And the respondents overwhelmingly said it's about respecting a country's political institutions and laws, working hard and following the rules, actually being a legal citizen, speaking English well, having a job, owning a home. And so when you think about what American and becoming American means for this population, it's really the rhetoric that we as a government also kind of want to emphasize, that there's a benefit to becoming a U.S. citizen, but there's also rights and responsibilities, and this population seems to be very keenly aware of that and to say it for themselves. In terms of why we do this kind of work and why we think this is an area of investment that is well worth continuing, we understand that the decision to naturalize is very complex. There are reasons back in your country of origin or reasons about things that are going on in the country of destination, like elections and personal finances, one's personality or familial considerations that make one ready to become a U.S. citizen. And better understanding these decisions and their timing allows us as an agency to predict future flows and be responsive to the needs of our customers, to eliminate barriers to the process, because we asked a number of questions about things that made it harder to become a U.S. citizen, and anticipating not only what naturalization means in the life of an immigrant, but how it impacts themselves and their families and their eventual integration into U.S. society is important. When we did the study, we had no idea that people would be so willing to be participants and respondents in the work that we were doing. We had one gentleman who actually contacted the research firm that was doing the study, who was a refugee, and he had also been someone who had stepped on a landmine. And because this was primarily a telephone survey, had said that while he wanted to participate by phone, he primarily hears crickets in his ears, and so he couldn't really hear the questions that the telephoner was asking him, and would we send him a mail survey, which of course we did. But he also said in that letter that for him, becoming a U.S. citizen was really about not only his own survival, but that of his future generations of his family, and that the process was made so easy, it reaffirmed his belief in our country, and becoming a citizen is one of the most important things and milestones in his life. And so I think that as we conduct this research, we were extremely touched by people's willingness to tell their stories about becoming a citizen, as well as to participate in the work that we're doing. And we'll have a time for questions, I think, after the panel is complete. So thank you much.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And so now from the present, we'll move a bit into the past with Katie. Thank you.
Hi, I got a little teary at that last story, so I have to focus. I'm going to try to be really brief here. My current work, as mentioned in the introduction, centers on a congressional study of immigrants and immigration that was held from 1907 to 1911, known as the Dillingham Commission, named for a senator from Vermont who chaired that body. The commission hired famous social scientists, had 300 employees, and made contact with some 3 million residents of the United States. It also traveled abroad and interviewed immigrants. Its methods included long-form census-type interviews with tens of thousands of immigrants, often in cooperation with their employers. It surveyed and measured school, and by measure school children, I mean weighed and measured their heads, often without any kind of informed consent, one of the things I'm looking at currently in my research. They investigated inmates of asylums and prisons. They conducted undercover investigations of transatlantic steamships and immigrant prostitution rings. They produced the largest study of immigrants in American history, 41 volumes of rather dry reports, some parts more exciting than others. And these reports came at a similar era of mass immigration, and I should add controversy over immigration. The Commission's data became the evidence for those who supported the immigration restrictions of the 1920s, which reduced the once massive Eastern and Southern European immigration to the United States to a trickle and barred almost all Asian immigration until 1965. In contrast to today, I should add, they had almost no interest in Mexican immigration, which remained proportionally very small at this time. In my remarks today, I want to focus on two aspects of the past that offer interesting perspective on the material presented today about the motives of naturalizing immigrants. The first point I want to make is that the process of naturalization was undergoing significant change a century ago. It still discriminated on the basis of race and gender. Although it seems almost unbelievable today, in the 19th century, naturalization was a decidedly haphazard, almost ad hoc procedure. The Constitution's Article 1, Section 7 said that Congress could, quote, establish a uniform rule of naturalization, unquote, but the rules varied over time. An immigrant often did not need to be naturalized to vote, and in fact, in a surprising turn, the last state to change that law, so the last state where non-citizens were allowed to vote was Arkansas into the 1920s. Naturalization could be achieved in any American court, even by a justice of the peace. The Democratic Party conducted mass naturalizations of Irish immigrants, thus ushering in new voters. I'm talking about the early 20th century, just for the record. Moreover, the laws were overtly racially discriminatory. Very quickly, a 1790 law offered naturalization only to, quote, free white persons, unquote. An 1870 modification, after the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, changed it to, quote, white persons and persons of African descent, unquote, pointedly leaving out Asians. Chinese immigrants were not eligible for naturalization until 1943, and other Asians until 1952. The 14th Amendment did, however, give their children birthright citizenship, which was tested and upheld by the Supreme Court in several important decisions. A new law in 1906 federalized naturalization. It required that a naturalized citizen speak English and allowed judges to ask a series of civics and history questions that are sort of precursor to today's process. The racial discriminations remained, as did serious sex discrimination. Married women immigrants could not apply for citizenship independent of their husbands. A Jewish immigrant challenged this law, or this rule, I should say, and that was upheld by the courts. Likewise, women received their husband's citizenship status when he naturalized. So what this meant is that married immigrant women could never affirmatively testify to and prove their desire for American citizenship. In conclusion, then, naturalization laws a century ago were on the one hand lax, but on the other hand blatantly discriminatory. The second point I want to make today is that the Dillingham Commission had very little interest in the kinds of questions that the fiscal year 2008 survey that Dr. Lightbourne discussed focused on. In other words, the Dillingham Commission was concerned about the kinds of immigrants coming to the United States, but it was less interested in figuring out what motivated those immigrants to naturalize or how they perceived themselves as Americans. Although they wrote 41 volumes in typical fashion of government reports, people only read their 40-page summary, and in particular, their 2 pages of recommendations on policy. And actually, unlike a lot of commission reports, this one was actually very important because almost every recommendation that they made on changing immigration policy was eventually implemented. So it's particularly notable that they had almost nothing to say about naturalization. They had 2 recommendations that dealt indirectly, and I shall say negatively, with naturalization. Both were cast in exclusionary rather than inclusionary terms. One recommendation suggested the deportation of any, quote, aliens who attempt to persuade immigrants not to become American citizens, unquote. Here, the Commission was suggesting that the U.S. bar negative influences on naturalizers rather than promoting naturalization per se. The second relevant recommendation suggested barring from entry any immigrant aliens who come to this country, this is their wording, with no intention to become an American citizen or even to adopt a permanent residence. This recommendation reflected widespread opposition to the temporary immigration of foreigners willing to work for very low wages. Now, I should add that this shows that they wanted to see people on a path to citizenship, although they offered no real proactive way to get them on that path. But more importantly, that this is an era in which, with the exception of Asian immigrants and a few categories of people with communicable diseases, there was really no illegal immigration as we speak of today. These were essentially open categories. So we're talking about that recommendation they made in the context of legal immigration. They found that Eastern and Southern Europeans were the least likely to naturalize, and that was accentuated by the fact that, quote, such persons are usually men unaccompanied by wives or children, unquote. That also contributed, so they felt that those were people least likely to naturalize, and they were the people that they most wanted to bar. In its final summary report, and this gets to the point about the grant announced today, the Commission did note the work of non-governmental organizations in promoting citizenship. it approved of what it found to be the group's particular stress on the duties and privileges of American citizenship and civilization. So they endorsed the civic and naturalization education conducted by nonprofit groups like immigrant aid societies, including some of the precursors of the organizations that were named today. But it did not suggest that it become actively involved in this. And in fact, what's interesting is that in a letter to the Commission that it published in one of its reports, the International Committee of the YMCA urged that the federal government do much more to encourage naturalization. It wanted to see the federal government expand its citizen education pamphlets and information, check, rather than simply relying on private organizations like the Y to do so. It wanted an expansion of government-funded English classes, check. It wanted the number of courts for naturalization to be expanded, that was not announced. And it wanted the process to be free, not in this budgetary era, and it wanted the government to print naturalization information in several languages. I hear that's a work in progress. It suggested a series of stereopticon talks on American opportunity, ideals, and rights. Stereopticon talks, of course, being the precursor to today's PowerPoint. And it urged that these slides and lecture notes be loaned to schools and other institutions to foster interest in naturalization. But in noted contrast from the announcement today, the Dillingham Commission in 1911 took a deeply hands-off approach to naturalization and concluded that it does not appear that the federal government can directly assist in this work, but where possible, efforts should be made to promote the activities of these organizations. So I want to conclude here, and I welcome any questions, half of which I probably can't answer, but please delve more if you'd like in Q&A. The point I want to make here is that where the Dillingham Commission was looking to restrict access to American citizenship, these new programs look to expand it. They embrace that we are a diverse nation of immigrants and that we are a nation that welcomes and supports those immigrants' journey toward citizenship. And I guess as a historian, I hope that these new initiatives are a beginning of many more ways to support this journey, one that almost all of us have ancestors who participated in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. And with that, I'll turn it over to Doris.
Well, thanks very much. And I have to start by saying I love people who can make history come alive. That was great and very instructive. Some of you know that it's probably fair to say that naturalization was the favorite part of the job for me when I was among you. So I love this discussion, and I certainly am pleased to have been asked to participate. I want to really congratulate you, Tiffany, and USCIS for investing in this initiative. This is just exactly the kind of thing that I think government agencies ought to be doing, and getting some greater insight into a process and a part of the immigration system as important as naturalization is really a very worthwhile thing to do. So I'm really glad to see that this is underway. Now, I've been asked to take my time to answer two questions. Why does this matter? And what's important here in what's been said? So let me try to very quickly use my time to do just exactly that. Well, it matters for probably two sets of reasons. First of all, it does matter operationally, and that goes to the core, of course, of what USCIS's job is. It also matters as a broader window of understanding into this part of the immigration system. And so on the operational side, I think that it's quite practical to do these sorts of things. The surge that happened in 2007, 2008 was historic. It was unanticipated. It created enormous problems for the agency and for the administration, and a lot of those problems were underscored by people that are in this room, so it's very good to see people coming together at this point. But the agency simply was unprepared. It was unprepared in terms of its antennae and understanding of what it was hearing and being told, but it was also unprepared because of the nature of the agency, the way the agency is funded, structural kinds of things that are part of another conversation. But real tangible results, I hope, of research like this is that it does help the agency to cope with those kinds of possibilities in the future so that there isn't that sort of a situation that faces either the agency or its immigrant population and the larger customer population that's involved here. And I also think that in addition to the question of surges and whether there really is any way of anticipating surges and how it is that one could operationally have contingency plans in place that help to respond and all of that sort of thing. I mean, that's the obvious, immediate operational rationale for doing something like this. But I do think more broadly, if we could ever get to the point of recognizing what everybody that's been in this business knows, which is that naturalization as an adjudication is a growth business, which is to say that every naturalization application that is adjudicated generates, hypothetically, at least 2, if not 4 or 5, additional petitions. Now, we don't even know exactly what number that is, but that's worth knowing. And it means that there are real feedback loops here in terms of what doing a naturalization piece of work means for what it's going to lead to in immigrant petition, other forms of petitions because of the family members that are allowed to come with. So these are very important reasons just in and of themselves to do this kind of work. But I also think that the broader reason, the reason of having a window into understanding the process of naturalization from the standpoint of the immigration system writ large and what that means in terms of immigration policy for the country is also extremely worthwhile. I mean, we are obsessed with the debate about illegal immigration for obviously good reasons, but it sucks the oxygen out of debate on any other topic. And this topic is a very important topic. It's an important topic from the standpoint of the agency's work, from the standpoint of where the country is going, from all kinds of reasons. And it's fascinating to me that what you say in your historical rundown simply underscores the point. It wasn't of interest to the Dillingham Commission. It hasn't been of interest to anything but an insider community, today. And yet we're at a period of peak immigration where this process matters. So I'm glad that there is an opportunity to shine more of a spotlight on it and get more of an understanding of it. And I think that it's good to get a bit ahead of the curve on this because I don't think any of us would be talking out of turn by saying that we have no idea whether any kind of immigration reform is really going to happen in the near term. And if it does not happen in the near term, things like this are going to be increasingly important because what we have is the INA. And the issue will be and is, how do you get the Immigration and Nationality Act to most fully meet its objectives? And part of its objectives are the immigration of relatives of citizens without regard to quotas and ceilings, and we will want as a country, and should be wanting as a country, to maximize those goals of our current immigration law. So I think it does matter, and those are some reasons why it matters. Now, what's important here? Well, I mean, there's something important about almost everything that you've said, Tiffany. I mean, they all lead to really interesting questions, and they're all useful pieces of data, some of them somewhat familiar, some of them not so familiar. So I'm going to just pick out a couple that I think are particularly interesting and try to spin out just a little bit what they might mean and what other kinds of questions we might ask from them. I am struck by the 41% came in the 1990s, because what that means, this is 2008 data, I believe. So what that means is that we have a pattern here that I think is a familiar pattern over many years, which is that people do not typically naturalize just at the 5 years when they are eligible. It's a longer process. It is for lots of reasons. and the reasons are interesting in and of themselves. But I think I would want to know out of this research how that does differ or is similar from what the pattern has been over time, and whether it is different by countries. Because there's always been the view that contiguous countries, people from contiguous countries, take a longer period of time to get to the point of naturalizing because their ties are reinforced by contiguity. And it would be interesting whether that has changed in any way by other new circumstances within the United States, particularly what we know the political circumstances to be, simply the critical mass of immigration from particular countries, etc. So that 7 to 12 year period, which has typically been the norm for when it is that the peaks occur of when people naturalize, it'd be really very interesting to know whether that is still holding or whether that is being affected by other factors that haven't been the case before. I'm also very interested, and I'm sure the agency is very interested, in the issue of barriers to naturalization. That's obviously very important from the standpoint of encouraging naturalization. And I think there are a couple things here that are really interesting in the research that you've laid out, which is, of course, the sort of typical reaction is, well, one of the barriers to naturalization is high fees. And I'm not sure that that's true at all. But you certainly want to be able to try to answer that question as much as possible with this research. I do think, though, that the fee issue does need to be linked with what you're showing here about the percentage of people that are relatively higher educated in this sample, because that was a real wow for me. And so that if what's happening is that it's the more highly educated people, which you certainly can equate with higher income, or I think that's a fair comparison or equation to make, then you may have some clues about the fee, but I don't think that can ever be a solitary cause and effect that's made. The other very interesting thing here, of course, is English language. And English language, it seems to me, and I think most people that have worked in the field, has always been the single biggest barrier. No matter what gets said about fees and the outcry and all of that sort of thing, it's the testing, and the testing especially of English language. Because we are all, as human beings, concerned about a foreign language no matter what, and certainly about tests on a foreign language, and whatever it is that the government says about it's a basic level, 6th grade, whatever it is that we're norming, the norm is today, that is a real barrier. And it seems to me that too correlates with this higher education. If you have people here in this sample who are relatively higher educated, they're likely to be higher earners, and they're likely to be better at their English language, and therefore they're more likely to have the confidence and the means to naturalize. That would be really important to know, and it'd be really important to know that profile vis-a-vis what the profile is of lawful permanent residents in general, but lawful permanent residents who are possibly eligible to naturalize if one can disaggregate to that level. But just going with lawful permanent residents would be fine, because I suspect, looking at this, that it is not representative. And to that extent, there's a real challenge in terms of encouraging naturalization, and that challenge is underscored by what it is that we know is going on in the English language world now in our fiscal situation. Because our fiscal situation is one where the states are having to cut back, and adult education and English language services by public institutions is really being eviscerated. In fact, in the state of California, which is obviously one of the big targets, it's probably being eliminated as we speak. So you've got some possible collision courses here that are really worrying in terms of what it is that one would want to have happening with naturalization and encouraging naturalization. So I hope that, as you really dig into this research, some of that can start to be elicited. I do think that there are a couple of other things here that are both operationally important and important from a policy standpoint. That was the high use of study materials and the high use of the internet, which also I think are somewhat surprises and are not kind of what the conventional wisdom tells us, because what they say to me is what I think we've also known, and that is that whatever is said, by and large, the immigrant population trusts the government when it comes to the standpoint of, when it comes to the point in the process where you're dealing with naturalization. They've been here long enough. If they can access government information and services, they'll use that, which does not mean that there is not a role for intermediaries, but it isn't this total we-they kind of a situation. So that really plays very positively into the strategy of providing information, providing materials, creating enabling circumstances to encourage naturalization. And it also, I think, plays very much into another sort of anti-conventional wisdom thing. This is likely a much more sophisticated population than we often give it credit for. You know, there tends to be this view that you can't go to immigrant populations with technology because they, you know, are marginalized from the system and all that sort of thing. To some extent, some communities, of course, but by the time people are ready to be naturalized, you can use modern methods. And that's extremely important from the standpoint of where the agency goes in its overall automation and in its overall, the tone that it sets in terms of communication with immigrant communities. I mean, I just, you know, have always wanted to see an automation system where, but when you're here 5 years, you automatically get a notice because the government has the information to know that you're now eligible, and it says you're eligible to naturalize, and this is what you would do, and here's the services you would get, and reinforce that with a notice every year. It's just information, but it lets people know that somebody knows about them and is interested in creating access for this very important process. And I even would love if at the end of the day that could travel over to the State Department once the naturalization happens and generate an automatic passport if people want to pick it up. Because what you don't have in here, and I hope maybe is in the other research, is that the single most next step that people take when they naturalize is to go get a passport. So let's be seamless where that is concerned. They do that even before they buy a home and property, although that is a very important, outcome. So some of that bundle of information, I think, is extremely interesting and could have very, very important implications for the agency and for how the agency and therefore the government relates to these populations. Finally, let me say some things about integration, because you've asked some fascinating questions here about integration, and the very preliminary findings that you've given us, of course, are encouraging. But I want us also to be very nuanced and careful about the integration messages here. And I hope that what this research can do is help to speak to a debate that's been taking place for quite some while among people who worry about these things, and that is whether naturalization is a threshold step into fuller integration, or whether it is essentially a ratification of an already pretty established process that is taking place. Whichever way it is, it's important and it is positive. But just because there's participation and just because there are the kinds of answers on the indicators that you've given doesn't necessarily mean that the naturalization has led to, that there's a cause and effect. It may very well be that, I mean, we know immigrants go to church in very, very large numbers well before they naturalize, and that's the highest, community participation. And we certainly know that in terms of political participation, this last election in 2008 and the surge was almost sui generis. So we've got to find a way of kind of checking for that. But as I say, whichever it is, it's not that there's a right or a wrong answer. It's that we need to understand what naturalization is vis-a-vis integration rather than simply go for a direct cause and effect. So let me finish with that and say that I think the other interesting thing that was said here was that there is a whole list in the charts of items that you weren't able to talk about, and that the bottom line here is more to come, and that's just terrific. I'm very fascinated to see the more to come. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Doris. You know, I heard from the panelists here, we're almost talking at two levels here, the process of naturalization, the practical, the operational, and how we actually serve our immigrants. And then this notion of citizenship as an identity. And I think that's how we serve ourselves as a nation. And it's that intermingling and interweaving that really gets us towards this conversation about integration. And I hope that you will pose to our panelists some questions that might get to that notion of integration and both the practical and this notion of identity. So with that, if you could let us know your name, please, and the organization you're representing, please pose some questions. Thanks. One at the front here.
Guess I'm the least shy. I always seem to be the first. Peggy Orchowski. I'm the congressional correspondent with the Hispanic Outlook magazine on higher education. I've got a couple of questions. I think anyone who's following the Latino political movement knows that there was a huge campaign in 2007 to naturalize 1 million people, and obviously they were successful. But that million, a million apparently happened. You had a surge that you didn't expect. But what I'm curious about is, do you know? I understand that that most of them, or maybe the small majority, were not Latinos, as the Latino groups had hoped, but were Asians. So I'm just curious if you have a breakdown of that surge by that kind of thing. And I loved your comments, Doris. I just thought there was just some really, really interesting things. And in terms of anticipating and being ready for the next surge, if this DREAM Act passes, there's going to be almost 1 million people who are going to be immediately eligible for green cards. So is the department prepared for that?
Tiffany, would you like to take on this notion of demographics and
Sure.
who we have?
What we don't have is a direct correlation to the question you asked regarding whether or not someone was directly contacted as part of a campaign to naturalize by a political party, and did that result in their decision to naturalize. So that question we can't tell from our data. With regard to looking at differences by subgroup in terms of numbers of people naturalizing, we still see that Mexican Americans or Mexicans are the primary folks who are naturalizing, with 22% of the sample. Southeast Asian, we see quite a bit for Vietnamese and quite a bit for Chinese, and then for Southeast Asian, they're our third largest group. So
Do you know what percentage that was?
we have approximate, I can get you the numbers, sure.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can we get a copy of those before?
I'm not sure, are you posting these online or?
No, we're
No?
not.
Not sure what the communications plan is, but I'll get back to you on that.
Hi, I'm Delancey Gustin. I'm from the German Marshall Fund, and we also conduct a large public opinion survey of general attitudes about immigration in the United States, Canada, and 6 Western European countries. We have some data from 2008 that's very similar to some of the data that you have about what it is to be fully American. We found that people, general American populations, thought that it was much more important that people be fluent in English rather than, or in comparison to this immigrant population. So I think that's something interesting to explore. I was also, like Doris, surprised with the education levels of the population that you surveyed, and it seems, depending on how much college they have, they might even be more educated than the general American population, which is interesting. Considering that a lot of these new grant initiatives are focusing on, lower income groups and even pre-literate groups of, potentially eligible citizens, I wonder, when you look at the number saying that 19% of the people who naturalized had the application fee being the primary reason, or the application fee increase being the primary reason to do so, I wonder what this says in terms of, fee waivers and what kind of support that might that policy might have to gain from the data that you have here. Whereas, these lower income groups, if the naturalization fee might be a little too high for them, and what that says about the future of possible fee waivers. Thanks.
Tiffany, did you see anything like that in your?
Sure. In terms of the thinking about whether or not this population looks like the American population or not, that's actually one of the things I've asked our contract firm to go back and actually do, is to get a robust set of statistics about sort of how are native-born citizens faring on these same indicators and comparing the two groups. So we should have something about that in the full report. In terms of English language fluency, that was a variable that we were able to create as of yesterday to be able to look at some of these things and to see the role. When I say this is hot off the presses and sort of a very emerging analysis of the data, it definitely is. But looking at the role of English language acquisition is important. We know there are subgroup differences based on country of origin in terms of who's most likely to speak English well. We also know in terms of internet use that there are subgroup differences, and these are all lovely conflated with each other in terms of education, country of origin, and so you will find things like, for example, Indians being the most likely to have internet access, and you may find much less access for Mexicans and Vietnamese. And so what that means in terms, and is that a country of origin issue, or is that an education level issue, is that an income issue? There's lots of data analysis to be done to kind of look at more so that the causal relationships between these variables. But we know at the demographic level that you're right, that there are some differences between the groups in this way. And we definitely will be looking at that.
Thank you. Now, I'm sorry to disappoint, but we have time for one more question, and our window of opportunity here with Katie is quickly closing as well.
I have to teach class.
She has to teach class. So after teaching us, she will move on. So if there's a question for Katie, I'd be glad to entertain that now. And if there's one more hand in the there in the back corner, first in, best dressed.
Sonia Michelle from the Wilson Center. Sorry, this is not a question for Katie.
That's okay.
I've asked Katie many questions in the past.
And
this
likewise.
is a question for Tiffany. To what extent, my understanding of the way the quotas work is that family unification is one of them, but the other ones, all the HB1 and all those visas are mainly geared toward high-skilled and highly educated people. So is it that surprising that you would find a high proportion of highly educated people in your sample?
There are numbers of ways that you can come into the country, and I see the furrows of my boss who may be formulating a response to this question. So if you'd like to respond to these, you may. But there are a number of different categories that people can come into the country. The H-1s are just one series of those that target high skilled workers. And so while we do see some variety in terms of the types of ways people come into the system, what we're hoping to do with our data, and we haven't done this just yet, is marry the data set on who's naturalizing with how they came into the country. So we can't answer that question just yet, but we're hoping to go back in our administrative data and link this data set with how you originally entered the country. And that would be one of the questions to look at, to see whether or not type of visa is making a difference.
Okay, with that, I'm very sorry we have to conclude this panel. Tiffany, Katie, Doris, thank you so much for these thought-provoking comments.